All right, welcome everyone. Before we get started, I do have a legal thing going on, and my lawyers did say that I needed to disclose something before this panel begins. So I do want to note for transparency that I am currently pursuing litigation against the Department of Justice over the application of unlicensed money transmission, specifically when they apply to software development. Coin Center has publicly supported this lawsuit, which I've been very appreciative of, and the DeFi Education Fund has also filed an amicus brief in support in July. So full disclosure, this is not going to be the most unbiased panel when it comes to digital rights. It seems that we probably don't have the most unbiased audience, so I think it's probably a good fit. But that's because we all care very deeply about protecting them. So I'm very happy to be joined by Ayana Dow from the DeFi Education Fund, who's one of their senior counsel, and then Jason Somensatto, who's the director of policy at Coin Center. So there's a lot of topics definitely to dive into on digital rights. It's been a very eventful few months on the Hill. We have Genius Act passed recently. We've had discussions and verdicts on certain money transmission cases. But first, just to take a step back, we had this conference about a year ago, different administration, different time, a year passed, and a lot has changed. So I would love to get a take from both of you, starting with you, Ayana. what's the how does it feel a year later? What has changed? What's the good? What's the bad? How are we feeling right now?
Yeah, I think it's day and night, some might say. We have Genius, as you mentioned, our first crypto law. And I think that it's great that we have been able to see that. And now we're working to continue on with rulemaking. That's going to be really the next step. So we've gotten over a hump, but our work isn't done. And we're working with others in the industry to make sure that we are being strategic in how we go about engaging with lawmakers and regulators as we go into this next step of the process.
Yeah, I think, so much has changed, in the last year, right? And I think in terms of weird disclosures, right? I worked in the last administration at the CFTC. And so in some ways I take a little bit, I get a little frazzled when everybody's oh, it was terrible back then, it's better now, right? I tend to think the SEC was a particularly difficult blocker, even for us as a sister agency.
Yeah, if you were at the SEC, we couldn't have you on stage, right?
That's right, right? Which, listen. But I think at least the way we've looked at it at the Coin Center is yes, right now what you have is a major change in tone in terms of how it's, the administration, how Congress is going to approach this industry in a very inviting way. I think where we're always focused at Coin Center is okay, what are the principles that are coming out under this? Because in some ways, and we'll get into these discussions, right? The concepts that are floating around in legislation are, for the most part, really good, but they've also been there for a while, and there's been a lot of work by our organizations and others here on those topics. And ensuring that continues is really important. I mean, we'll get into some of the discussions around money transmission prosecutions and that kind of stuff. And I think for us, it's a constant day and night keeping watch as to okay, we have a friendly attitude and we have a very proactive, we're going to address this industry. But I think that can sometimes hide where there's very real disagreements as to policy issues as to how this industry should develop.
For sure. All right. Well, yeah, let's get into probably the number one issue that people have probably been following over the summer. So there is a holdover from the last administration that this administration has continued in the Department of Justice, which is money transmission suits specifically against Tornado Cash and Samurai Wallet. And these were both cases where developers had built software that involved privacy features, and there were attempts, or essentially cases where criminals were able to use them, and through that and a lot of other areas, basically the Department of Justice pursued litigation. Among several charges was unlicensed money transmission, which I've obviously filing a lawsuit around this, so I have strong feelings about that. But I'd love to turn it over to you, probably starting with you, Jason, because obviously Coin Center's been at the forefront of this. You've been involved in the Tornado Cash sanctions case, and then have definitely been speaking out publicly around the Tornado Cash and Samurai Wallet cases. So first for the audience, what did happen over the summer that really changed the dynamic, and what does that mean going forward? What is Coin Center actively doing about it?
Yeah, and I think that gets directly to, I guess, maybe some of the tension you hear in kind of the way that I discussed the past year, which is you know, at the heart of these cases, right, is a question that I think has been like, I've been now in this industry for like 10 or 11 years working on legal issues, and I think most of it can be distilled down to like, when are we talking about like a trusted financial institution versus when are we talking about like some form of software program facilitating these transactions, and like how do we treat those differently? And so the criminal prosecutions in both those cases, like, I mean, I didn't read every page of like the transcript and stuff like that, but I will say at a high level, the DOJ was taking positions that very much seemed to take on the idea that like the development of software and the way they hold that software out there would be the type of thing that could make you liable for criminal violations, right? Not being registered as a money transmitter. And we can get into like the specifics of how those statutes work and the various differences, but I think like what is important is for us, like at a constitutional level, at a good policy level, that's not the right distinction, right? It is, and you see this, and this is what makes it so interesting, right? Like when you're having some of the regulatory discussions, for example, with the SEC right now, or having some of the discussions in Congress, like there is an understanding of that difference. Just in like the last 24 hours, you've seen that kind of bubble up on Twitter even. And so the fact that the DOJ was going to use like criminal sanctions against people for taking a position that we think is on the wrong side of that policy. And so you had these two prosecutions. One resulted in a guilty verdict against the Tornado Cash developer. The other one resulted in a plea out. And it just kind of creates this confusion because at the same time, we've heard really positive things out of Treasury, right? Like there's guidance that goes back to 2019 that talks about, hey, you know, if you don't have control over an asset, you're not a money transmitter. And so we've been pushing really hard, and we'll get into like a legislative fix towards this end. But like that has always been like kind of Coin Center's top priority, is getting this distinction right on the money transmission front. And these prosecutions are specifically like a loss to some extent on that front.
Gotcha. Yeah. And Ayanna, I know in DeFi Education Fund, there were people in New York following the case. I guess, where do y'all stand? This has been an area, like you know, DeFi would obviously be impacted by this in a lot of ways. There's a lot of integrations there. Anything that you have to add?
Yeah, for sure. This past year, the 1960 fix is what we've been calling it, has been our #1 policy priority at DeFi Education Fund. The misinterpretation of what it means to be a money transmitting business, and how that it is just so different from how decentralized finance even works. If a prosecutor can convince a court that if I don't have custody of these funds, but I can still be a money transmitter, like practically it doesn't make sense. But if this is the precedent that's being set, it essentially would get rid of DeFi, because there is no protection for software developers, which is why we've been advocating for a fix within the legislation, because we feel like we need it to be solidified in a statute, and also to be something that is not misinterpreted in the future.
You're here, and I guess that's a good segue into the next topic, which is what's going to be happening on the Hill over the next year. There's been, you know, we've passed Genius. There's lots of implications that are going to come from that, and then market uncertainties coming up. And we've heard some maybe pessimistic interpretations of where we're at from Eleanor and others that have been covering it, if you've been following on Twitter. So I guess starting with you, like, you know, in the post-Genius, like, what does Genius mean, and then where do you see market uncertainty going from here?
Yeah, there's been things happening in the past 24 hours, if anyone has seen. I think that at DEF, our core is education, and I think that that has been both something super beneficial as people come to understand DeFi, but also very difficult for folks who are really struggling to understand the concept and the underlying technology. So something that we've been focused on is like, what are the use cases that would get regulators and lawmakers to actually understand before they go in and start negotiations and take on other industry perspectives. So I think our next steps are really to just keep pushing forward. We'll continue to engage with those offices as they continue to draft and negotiate language. But the current draft market structure bill has the strongest developer protections that we've seen. So this is something that we'll just continue to fight the good fight.
That's good. Yeah, and it's a fight Coin Center's been fighting for a while. Developer protections, clarity, that's kind of Coin Center's baby. Like, how do you feel about where it sits?
Yeah, so the market structure legislation is a really complex effort, right? Some of these bills are in draft form, like a couple hundred pages. And just for like level setting for folks, what the effort is, right, is to define certain types of businesses that right now don't naturally maybe get regulated by the CFTC, or may have some question of whether you fall into the existing SEC jurisdiction. And the legislation is attempting to clarify, those lines, right? Like, hey, you can be a digital commodity exchange, like a lot of the crypto exchanges that we've seen, and you will have a regulatory scheme inside of the CFTC, or, hey, this is the line as to what is in the securities world and what's outside of that. Coming along with that are just like a million different issues, right? Like, how do we define these businesses? Going back to what we were just talking about of like, what's the difference between a trusted financial institution and some software, right? And so there is a section in these drafts right now that is like about developer protections that has been negotiated, educated on for a long time by our groups and others to get that balance right. As like people would expect, there are some people who are skeptical, like there's policy differences on that. And that also gets wrapped up in politics of like who's in control, who can, who's got a chance to write what they want to write. And so when you're trying to, and I guess overlaid over all of that goes back to the issue we were just talking about, which is like, I think both our organizations' number one priority is getting the Blockchain Regulatory Certainty Act passed, which has become a piece of this market structure discussion, which doesn't get to the SEC versus CFTC. It says for those businesses from an AML perspective that are being regulated as money transmitters, that designation needs to hinge on having control over the assets and not be a software-based business. And so now you have just so many moving parts, so many different negotiations that come in there that, like, it's going to be tough. It's different than Genius, which, like, there was always a decent amount of an agreement of like, okay, we're going to define some set of businesses as stablecoin issuers. We're going to give the authority to the, one of the regulators to kind of determine capital requirements. There was still a lot of policy conversations along those lines, but like passing big financial legislation in Congress is one, incredibly hard, and usually only done after like crisis, like Dodd-Frank after the financial crisis, Sarbanes-Oxley after Enron. And so I think we just sit at a like interesting moment where there's a lot of motivation to get something done. There has been a lot of work and agreement on certain provisions, but there's just like, just in the last 24 hours, there's always something that gets thrown in that makes it a complicated, like, to get across the finish line.
Gotcha. But basically, if market certainty can be passed, that would basically put us in a position where like the 1960 FinCEN guidance is essentially codified. Like that would mean that like cases like Samurai Wallet and Tornado Cash ideally couldn't happen in the future.
As it stands, like as the drafts stand right now, so there was a version passed out of the House, Clarity, that included, specific language, in the blockchain regulatory certainty as adapted for Clarity in a section that addresses that question. Similarly, drafts in the Senate have included that as well. And so like we spend a lot of time just making sure that remains the case and trying to explain why that should remain the case. What happened in the last 24 hours was not so much a like, hey, we want to take that section and remove it, but almost like a completely alternative offering that like didn't have the same impact. And so that's when you're like, wait a second, right? Like we were going towards this outcome, not that outcome. Like, should this change? Why do you want that to change? And I mean, it puts a lot of onus back on us to keep the education going and stuff.
Gotcha. All right, so it seems like those are like the most pressing like crypto topics, but there's also like a broader one that I know that has been getting a little bit more discussion. Coin Center recently put out a paper around digital identity, and I know this has become a topic. This has been an ongoing topic for probably decades now in terms of like surveillance, privacy. But in the crypto world, if you're doing, if you're operating something that is regulated, you usually have to KYC customers. You have to get identifying information, driver's licenses, maybe even social security numbers, things that are sensitive, and probably store that and hopefully don't accidentally disclose it. And Coin Center put out a really good paper around why that is not ideal. It leaves a lot of personal identifiable information around. It also sometimes just doesn't work, and often doesn't work to stop bad behavior that's intended to. So I guess going to you, Jason, like, what do you see, what opportunities does kind of the changes we're seeing for crypto industry present for like maybe the wider like digital identity issue of like how could we do that better in this new environment we're creating?
Yeah, I like the word you use there, like opportunities. I think in some ways it can be, a lot of people can interpret our work as like constantly trying to like prevent something from happening or passing, right? Or like trying to get people out of regulation. I tend not to see it that way. Like we're trying to educate on like how this stuff actually works, what's the right line to place there, like in line with, for us, importantly, like that gets based in like constitutional principles that we think a lot about. And like Peter and I spend a ton of time just like being real nerdy on those topics. But I think like and this was something a bit new for us, like there was a recognition of like, okay, is there something kind of more proactive that we can do and offer in this area? And I think like it's interesting. The Bank Secrecy Act has very good goals to it, right? Stopping money laundering. And like, I think we would even agree that like leveraging those regulated financial intermediaries to help with that process makes a lot of sense. But the position we take in the paper is like the current version of how this gets played out in practice is a mess, right? Like, it's like we all like provide every single piece of information we can to every financial institution, which maybe used to just be your bank, but now is every random tech company that's trying to get into this space. And you have, when you're trying to prove very little information about an individual, but you have these kind of honeypots of information and poorly, operated environments that are like subject to leaks, that are subject to abuse. And at the same time, like we work with a lot of stakeholders in the industry who are working on zero-knowledge proof concepts, multi-party computation ideas, with what they would say are better ways of doing identifiable like verification. And we came to that question of like, okay, are there policy issues here that need to be addressed for this to work? Like, is this just a market thing of like, oh, cool, if you make the better way of doing ID, like all the banks will adopt it? And I think the way we looked at it was like, no, there's like a lot of policy barriers to that being like a future. And so we put this paper together that talked about like kind of what would be needed to like see some large scale adoption of some of these newer technologies as a way of allowing somebody to only share a limited, the quintessential case is you need to prove you're over 18. Okay, then why do you need my address or why do you need my social security number? Is there a way to use like a zero knowledge proof environment to say, hey, this person's over 18? Well, that requires both like standard setting amongst the industry. That requires the regulators to be comfortable with that as a method. It's I want to be mindful of time and that I've been talking a lot, but like we put out a very long paper on that. But I think it all goes back to kind of some of the topics we were talking about, which is like, again, what is the right way to overlay regulation on this industry? And what is changing about the way the tech works that needs to change how the policy works? Because I think a lot of times we're like, hey, the policy needs to be tech neutral and needs to come at this, just the same way that we do in every other kind of regulated category. And the trick has been that like people seem to misunderstand the tech and want to apply it too broadly. This is maybe a case where that's a little different, where it's like, no, the tech is actually changing what's possible, and does like the regulation need to change, not to be tech specific, but to allow for that to happen.
Gotcha. What are your thoughts?
Yeah, and I think at the heart of that really is, at the base level, we all want the same things. It's just getting past the point of people accepting that there's tech that can accomplish the same goals that these regs are trying to reach. Like, obviously, we do not want illicit actors using back channels to conduct illicit activities. Like, everyone can agree on that. But that is not necessarily to say then we just need to ban it altogether. That's not how good policy is made. So I agree with everything you said. And I think that by putting out papers and like explaining what the tech can do kind of gets at the reason that we need to continue educating folks and making sure people understand in a way that use cases that resonate with them. Like you said, why should I give you my address if you just need to know that I'm a certain age? That makes sense in certain contexts, but it's kind of the same if you just apply it to DeFi, but that connection isn't made. And I think what we're doing is kind of bridging that gap between folks to say, these are the same things, just think about it a little bit differently.
Well, and I think that probably applies even broader with some of these DeFi, like beyond just like digital identity type stuff of like, okay, hey, we've got a transparent way to do pricing on an automated market maker. Like, do you need to then have regulation as to how you do pricing and stuff like that?
Yeah, very interesting. I guess with the time we have left, I'm curious to hear, like, going forward, you know, we're going to see, we have about a year until midterms. So it seems like market certainty and trying to get that passed with the Blockchain Certainty Act is kind of the top of the list. But, you know, past that, we're still going to have another 2 years of the Trump administration, with or without, like, a friendly Congress, we'll have to see. And then beyond that, like another administration. So, you know, we were kind of in a nice area where there's a lot we can get done. But what are some principles to like keep in mind now that we've got this breath of fresh air, but you know, we might not have it forever. And what's something that we maybe want to keep in mind as we go forward? Like, what are some principles that like Coin Center or DeFi Education Fund is really trying to focus in and key in on, and for anyone in the audience that you would want them to convey to their representatives locally, like things that they would want to say to them of like, this is what we care about and this is what you should support, so that they can kind of hopefully connect to the same threads you're trying to educate on in Congress?
I think for DEF's perspective, or from our perspective, software developer protections are our main priority. And as you said, that we are in a nice period where we have a friendlier posture towards the industry with this administration, but also administrations change. And we need to be prepared to not get too comfortable and stay ahead of things. I'll also say that we recently conducted a study with Ipsos that gave us a lot of good data on how Americans feel about DeFi and crypto. And one of the most interesting stats that I found is that while maybe around 3% said that they knew what DeFi was or how to use it, over 40% said that if there was regulation that they'd be more interested in becoming engaged with it. So I think that also taking into account what people do want is important, but also making sure that we're kind of staying on top of things as we move forward.
Yeah, I mean, besides the issues I mentioned, like, I guess maybe I would also like talk about how for Coin Center we focus a lot on like the users' rights to engage in these networks. Honestly, like one of the ways that I think about our work is kind of always grounded down in like constitutional principles, as I mentioned earlier. Like I think about like, okay, First Amendment issues really relate to that developer environment of like being able to write this code, you know, publish it, have, you know, allow people to find it and engage with it and build on of it. But then the kind of other big area that we focus on is like Fourth Amendment rights. This has come up obviously now, already talking about like the BSA and some of these digital identities, which is, you know, protecting people through the law from unreasonable search and seizures. And I think like right now we're at a place again where it's a very friendly environment for particularly the business community that wants to engage in this industry, and that, you know, there's a lot of like economic benefits to attracting these to a particular state or whatever. But there, at least in my like judgment of the environment, there's still at least a sense amongst, I would say, even people in this group, but like, you know, just to lay out there on Twitter, that like using the information that you can gain on people as a means of like prosecuting them selectively or saying like this is not an area we like is also very top of mind for us, right? Like I think we think about this technology and this industry as a way of, it's like freedom tech, right? It is this ability to allow individuals to interact and transact in a way that is separate and apart from like state oversight or like regulated financial institution oversight. Like that's still very much the heart of it. And so finding ways to protect people's rights to do that, and to not punish people for, you know, hey, like the viewpoint discrimination of what they might want to engage with, I think is really important. And like, listen, I think, you know, truthfully, there's a decent amount of discussion outside of this crypto area around like police rights, you know, how we use the government to go after people we don't like. And like, that hasn't yet, I feel like, fully overlapped into this area in some ways, because it's almost like a protected industry right now while it's in a favored status. As somebody who's been here 11 years, like that changes a lot, right? And so those are the things I would point out.
Hear, hear. All right. So it sounds like we're in a good place, but let's build as much as we can in the meantime in terms of regulatory safeguards so people can build out there and continue to innovate. So thank you both for coming, and thank you all for the audience.